Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started this afternoon. Hope you all had a good day so far and had some nice lunch. Hope everyone is still awake. Okay, so we have a great speaker this afternoon, Kincade, and he won't put us to sleep. He has an interesting topic to present, architects as innovation advocates, and I'm looking forward, along with all of you, to the presentation. Kyle has been a business architect with Cigna. He has worked on business architecture, vision, strategy across multiple industries in domains like financial, healthcare, manufacturing, and public sector. He has earlier worked in various positions with the Ontario Ministries of Government Service and Health, McKesson Corporation, and Principal Financial Group. So with a focus on business evolution, Kyle is an advocate of embracing design thinking and human-centered design to drive innovation in architecture, business vision, strategy, and products and services. Kyle's ongoing education in ecology, I'm guessing it's master's or something.
It's undergraduate, but yeah.
Okay. Has played a important role in driving innovation in the design and architecture of businesses by using ecological perspectives and ecological principles. We'll wait to see what those mean more when he talks, with an emphasis on the interconnectivity of people, products, organizations with the natural world. So thank you for being here, Kyle, and over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm really interested to see who is interested in innovation. So just kind of by a show of hands, who here is works more on the technical side, considers himself a technical architect or something? Excellent. How about data or information? Okay, and business architects? Excellent. And all others? Okay, perfect. So we've got a wide variety, and that's really, really exciting for me to see because, you know, innovation, I think a lot of people a lot of times think of, you know, those are things that the creative people do, right? It's the things that the product designers or, you know, the strategic thinkers and, you know, people driving strategy do. And really what I've always tried to advocate is that innovation, right, it happens regardless of what focus your job is on. And, of course, in architecture, that becomes really important. You know, we reflect everything that a business and an organization does, so in order to do that, we have to be innovative. So I was speaking with a colleague earlier this year, a business architect that I admire dearly up in Canada that I worked with. And he was talking to me about a multi-year initiative that they had been working on. They had produced all of the models, they had engaged all of the stakeholders, and in the end, they thought everything looked perfect. But he said to me, he said, Kyle, it felt like we failed. And I said, well, why is that? It sounds like you did everything right. And he said, we failed to capture the imagination of the business. There we go. And so I thought about that for a really long time, right? Imagination, right? It's the source for creativity. And really, creativity is the root of innovation. So if we as architects can't capture the imagination of our stakeholders, right, how can we even, you know, bring the creativity to the table and help drive innovation forward? So going back to what I was saying, that's why it becomes a really important part of our jobs, right? Not only does innovation advance, right, and maintain competitive edges that our organizations have, but it also gives the opportunity to connect and drive and enhance new value, right? It's the things that connect our customers and our employees and the entire world around us, right? It takes innovation to do that. So, as we all do, I've spent a great deal of time thinking about, a lot of the values of architecture and the things that we're good at as architects. So, driving efficiency, embracing reusability and recyclability, looking at structurability, connectivity, right? Problem solving, opportunity identification, functionality, simplification, flexibility, all of these adjectives, right? And again, reusability, right? That's what we're supposed to be really good at. So I always like to pretend that if we were product designers, architects would be really great at the Japanese art of Shin Dogen. And just so you understand a little bit about what Shin Dogen is, it was an art form invented by Kenji Kawakami in the 90s in Japan. And really to understand it, the focus of Shin Dogen as an art is to invent products that are useful in everyday life, but they're not really practical, right? So again, things you reuse, right? Things that we see every day. And as I thought more about that, I thought, well, really it's not innovation, right? We're just kind of putting the pieces together. We're trying to draw the picture, right? And to me, that's where we as architects need to step beyond all of those other, all the other adjectives, right? And we really need to drive innovation. So, speaking of art, I was in a classroom a few weeks ago and with a number of other business architects. And after which I was approached and somebody said to me, they said, Kyle, really, you're like the Bob Ross of architecture. And of course I was taken back a little bit, and I had to spend some time comparing my likeness to Bob Ross. And certainly it didn't have anything to do with my unsuperior whiteboarding skills or stick figures that I love to draw. But the more I thought about it, I thought, this individual's onto something, right? When we do architecture, we have to drive innovation from an artistic standpoint, right? We're not just, putting pieces together, again, connecting things, common components, right? So really, it's that artistic perspective. Now, the last time I got to work with John Ackman, any Ackman fans in the room? Yay! Okay, there we go, perfect. The last time I worked with John Ackman, year before last in Washington, D.C., we spent a lot of time talking about enterprise physics, right? I don't know anybody who's heard his rant on that, but yeah. With, his framework and everything like that. So, and he talks about his framework like a periodic table of the elements. And I'll be the first person to say, I don't deny that there is a science to architecture, right? But that's not what innovation is necessarily about. So over the course of my career, I've come to realize, that there is this other side, right? I've seen architecture drive people to think differently, to drive creativity, and to enable innovation, right? And to me, this is the art of architecture. Okay, so any painters in the room? Okay, we've got one. Great. So I thought, let's take, for example, one of the most renowned paintings in all of history, right? Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. So there's a great amount of speculation about this individual's emotions, right? And I'm sure we've all been through that analysis, right? Is she smiling? Is she happy? Is she angry? Is she upset? Is she euphoric, right? Like art, architecture is inherently subjective, right? And I think we've all come across that. If I asked anybody in this room if they've produced one artifact that was 100%, no questions, no subjectivity whatsoever, I probably wouldn't get many hands, right? But that's good, right? Because it's that subjectivity that really inspires innovation. It gives people the room to think, right? And the room to grow the creative thought. So, and two, one could probably write, and many have probably been written dissertations about the Mona Lisa, right? As well as the inspiration that a piece of art brings, right? Whether you're a painter or a sculptor or a photographer or a poet or a musician, right? It's all about the inspiration. Inspiration to act, inspiration to think differently, and inspiration to achieve the impossible, right? This is what innovation is all about. So like a piece of art, we as architects have to advocate innovation, right? And again, getting back to inspiring others, leaving space for innovation, for subjectivity, and inspiring, promoting, and enabling creativity in all of the stakeholders that we engage on a daily basis. So I don't have any children of my own, but I have 2 nieces and a nephew. And early on, I lost track of all of the coloring book photos, right, I received. And I remember at one point in time I said, well, that's awfully prescriptive, right? I might see some variation in the color and, something like that, but there's a whole lot of structure there, right? But I've also seen a lot of architecture that does this, right? It's essentially a coloring book that you're handing over to your stakeholders and saying, okay, fill in the colors, right? So if architecture becomes a coloring book, especially to our organizations, we've severely limited the capacity of people to be creative, right? So what would be a better approach, right? Are we the people who supply the canvas and the paint? Do we supply the crayons, right? Do we provide a backdrop? How do we go about that? So I'll be the first to say that's not an easy thing to do, right? As architects, we often think of our job as this, but we need to inspire creativity and innovation at the same time. So sometimes organizations, and when I say organizations, I mean the collective of people, right? And that's really important. But people and organizations are a lot of times scared to innovate, and that's why they love architecture, right? Because it lets them pick some colors, connect the dots, fill in the blank spaces. And that's not always good for innovation, right? So that or organizations, they don't know how to be creative. So we as architects, again, as advocates of innovation, really have to carry them along, right? We have to learn how to enable creativity and innovation in the people we work with. And of course, that being the root of innovation. So as a starting point, one of the things I've learned is that really, to measure the value of architecture on this level, you need to start measuring your success based upon how effectively you are inspiring people to think differently, right? And that's really where you're going to start to drive innovation, because when people think differently, they're going to see the world in a different way. They're going to see their organization in a different way. So one area I've consistently been able to drive success, especially on this level, right, is connecting architecture and organizations with customers. So another quick survey. How many of you are employed by organizations which have some sort of vision or mission, value proposition about the customer, delivering value to the customer, customer experience, blah, blah, blah? Okay, yeah, quite a few. Another show of hands. So how many actually feel that your organization really, truly, and deeply understands what that means and is delivering fully on that commitment? Okay, we've got a few, and that's good. So really what this gets to is it's about the human connection, right? People with people. It's a powerful driver of innovation. Why? Because even if we don't like to admit it, we're emotional beings, right? We intrinsically long to feel what others feel and have others feel what we feel. So really, it's this human interaction that kind of acts as the root of creativity and innovation, right? So in a lot of that human experience, it's like an iceberg, right? There's a lot of things that happen on the surface when our organizations engage our customers. But the whole mast is beneath the water. You can't see it, right? And that's where all of the emotion comes from, right? And again, those are the things we need to get at, things below the surface, to really help drive innovation from this perspective. So we'll look at it this way. As architects, we drive innovation by connecting people with people, right? And we're going to use that emotion to elicit creativity. Now, before we go too far, and this is regardless of how many organizations I've seen focused on customer needs, right? We have to understand why emotion is so important. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about this over my career too, right? We live in a society today which has shifted from customer need, right? If you want to think about it from Maslow's perspective, to customer preference. And if you don't believe me, the next time you're in the grocery store, go take a walk down the cereal aisle, right? Preference is driven by emotions. And of course, that preference is really the root of why we innovate, right? Because again, we're trying to connect with people's emotions. So one example I always love to pull out, and I'll pull it out again later here, but the evolution of cars, right? The Ford Model T. We started out with what Ford, I think, had actually 4 different varieties of it, a handful of colors, and that was about it. If we look at the number of vehicles and colors, transmission types, seat fabric, whatever, it's all about preference, and again, connecting with people's emotions and driving that individuality. I also love to pull out the iPhone example, right? The iPhone was never sold as a need, right? It was sold as a preference. And it even went further because it was marketed as a lifestyle, right? And we've seen how the mobile device has kind of become part of that lifestyle. So, in summary, really the intrinsic needs have become easier for us to meet. And it's really, again, this preference, the emotion that we're trying to drive as organizations. And that's why we have to be creative, right? That's why we need to innovate, because we need to continue to figure out how to connect with people's emotions. And that's why people continue to search for more meaningful experiences when they engage organizations, right? So how are they going to satisfy their emotions? Another perspective on this too, right? We talk a lot about customer values. Values are often driven by those preferences, right? And or vice versa. They can drive each other. But a lot of times they're deeply rooted in emotion. So again, let's think about the food industry, right? We've seen all of this drive towards organic food, buy local, buy locally made, locally grown, sustainable, right? Again, there's values to the humans who are driving a lot of those industries, right? And that's why these things happen. And that's why we innovate, to make the connection with that. So, again, over the course of my relatively youthful career in architecture, I've lost count of the number of times architecture has been sold and valued as driving down costs, driving up revenue, increasing efficiency, reducing complexity, right? Architecture is inherently inward focused in organizations, right? If any customer saw any of the diagrams that we produce, I would venture to guess not much of it would make sense to them, right? Because when the customer sees our organizations, this is what they see, right? They see a brand, they see marketing, they see products, right? Those are the human experiences. And again, those are the things we need to drive connection with from an architecture perspective in order to drive that creativity. Again, enable innovation. So until architecture really figures out how to meld those two perspectives, we're going to have a difficult time connecting people with people, on an emotional level. So again, the human experience should be part of our organizations, right? It's the primary source of inspiration. And it's up to us, right, architects, as artists, to illustrate and communicate and drive those perspectives forward. And of course, not to forget those people who execute, right? Our employees, even our stakeholders, right? All of these people have emotions too, and we can use those as sources of inspiration for innovation, right? So one of the things I, at a minimum, wanted to do was to at least provide you with a toolkit that you can take away and start applying on a daily basis to be more creative, right? To drive innovation. So step number one, we're going to say iterate, right? I've seen so many architects be so obsessed, right, with perfection. It can't go out the door until it's exactly correct, right? And until it's been signed off and this and that, right? Iteration is one of the most powerful tools of innovation. And that's because it gives us time to step away, right? And it's that time away that enables rework, new approaches, new perspectives, right? Again, these are some of the most powerful enablers of innovation. And you have to iterate to do that. So if we can move further away from perfection and more towards, again, getting things out the door, continuing to iterate on them, realizing that they're not perfect, it gives us more opportunity to innovate each time we come back to the table and talk about these, right? Over on the right-hand side here, I have a diagram that is based off of, I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with the organization IDEO, but they certainly drive, right, a lot of work in the perspectives from design thinking and human-centered design, right? Iteration is a big part of those. We'll talk a little bit more about them here. But also tell a story, right? If you can't tell a story, it's just a piece of paper, right? So I want you to think about this too. When you're creating artifacts, is it really telling a story? And if not, how can you get it to tell a story? Working in healthcare for quite some time, I've often seen it drawn, again, very linearly, right? We talk about from disease to health, right? Somebody's ill. How do we get them back to being healthy? And I'm not sure that's really the whole story, right? So a lot of times what I've tried to embrace, and I think storytelling really goes back to this too, but it's about cyclic thinking, right? So not only is it from disease a transition back to health, but there's the transition from health to disease. And it's this constant cycle that becomes the story of what healthcare is all really about. We'll go on to number 3 here. So I'm sure we've all seen this one. Create an innovative environment, right? Most of us come into work every day, the same cube, the same office, the same building. It becomes monotonous, right? And monotony is one of the biggest killers of innovation, right? So we have to continue to drive to change our environment, right? So, again, you can do this individually, and you can do this for a team and for an organization. I'll speak to a book, but at the end here, but there's a lot of ideas and suggestions, and again, you'll see it comes out of IDEO, but for driving how you can change your environment, right? Because when you can change your environment, it gets people to leave all of their preconceived notions behind and enable them to think more creatively, again, drive innovation. My favorite one, be visual. One of my colleagues here told me once upon a time that oftentimes a lot of the architecture we have looks like boxes on a page, right? That's not visual. That doesn't tell me a story. That doesn't help me understand. So use pictures, right? That's the artistic side of architecture. And that's what's really going to drive creativity, right? Because otherwise, it is just boxes on a page, maybe a few words, right? I think a lot of that speaks to, too, anybody here who loves the form versus function debate? I think as architects, a lot of times we focus on the function, right? We forget about the form. And that's really important that we don't do that, right? And I love the analogy, too. As architects, right? When you go into building a building, right? We've all heard this analogy. We create the blueprints, right? We create the many perspectives. But a designer who builds a building, I can tell you, they don't start with the blueprint, right? they're going to start with a model of something that they see in their mind, a visualization, right? And that's what's really important. And that's what we need to convey, and that's how we be advocates of innovation. Another tool, build it. So you haven't lived until you've built a conceptual data diagram out of Play-Doh and string, right? Get your hands on something, right? Again, it's all about getting the mind to think differently, to inspire, different and new ways of thinking about things. And when you work with your hands, that becomes a really important stepping stone to driving creativity, right? Again, it's kind of like changing up your environment. We're changing our methods. We need to find new ways to look at things. Understand the human experience, right? And this goes back to the whole concept about human-centered design, right? If you're designing something, it has to be for humans. I can't tell you, even in business architecture, the number of times that I've seen market segment, target audience, customer represented, right? At the end of the day, I think a lot of us, and especially the organizations we work for, forget those are real people. Those are people with emotions, right? And if our products, our services, the technology we create, the websites we build, right? If they don't connect with real people, you can't be innovative, right? So really, again, and this is kind of contrary to architecture, but sometimes we have to focus on the specific to get to the abstract, right? And remove the abstract from the picture. And again, that's part of being the artist. So another one, and I absolutely love this one. This has to be my favorite. Apply unrelated perspectives. So in my introduction, it was mentioned, right? I study ecology. And a lot of times people look at me and say, well, you've worked in finance, you've worked in healthcare, you do business architecture. Why on earth are you in school studying ecology? Well, that's so I can apply unrelated perspectives. I can't even begin to tell you the number of examples that exist out in the natural world that can be applied to a business, right? That can be applied to technology, that can be applied to information, right? It's all the same. This is one diagram I threw together once upon a time, but really even understanding a lot of times from an analytical standpoint, how we look at ecosystems, right? And applying that to how we look at businesses. And that's really what applying unrelated perspectives is all about. So use your experience in completely unrelated things and try and figure out how you can bring that to the table, right? And or how you can even facilitate others to do that. Use your talents, use your education, use your knowledge, use some of the things you're passionate about, and find those connective points, right? Find the patterns. One of the things, shortly before my presentation today, I read through my Twitter profile, and I looked at my introduction, and it says, business architect, designer, steward of the natural world, musician, lover of animals, vegetarian, advocate of visionary thinking and compassion. Right, and that's what applying unrelated perspectives is all about, broadening our horizons and trying to bring it all together and applying it in new and different ways. Another example I absolutely love. There are several leadership courses now, I believe, and being in Minnesota, hopefully a number of them here, that drive leadership by taking people out into the wilderness and watching wolves interact, right? Right? And again, a lot of it's about applying unrelated perspectives to help people understand, to help them put the picture together, right? It's all about that analogy. Another tool that I think is really powerful here too is to embrace the unintended use, right? So back to our Ford cars. When Ford made the Model T, they did not anticipate that it would be used as a tractor, right? They didn't anticipate that people were going to be hooking belts up to it to run generators and to mill wood and saw and things like that. But again, that's another way we can drive innovation, right? We're surrounded daily by all of these new things, right? Even in architecture, components, technologies, things like that. How can you use that in new and different ways? And that's how you can drive innovation, right? That's what we've got to figure out. And really, this kind of embraces the whole concept of life hacks. Who here is familiar with life hacks? Right? We've heard of life hacks, sure. And that's, again, albeit a little silly, but right? How can you take the tools we have today and use them in new and different ways? That's about driving innovation. One of my, again, favorite examples here is recently I read an article about a assistant professor at, I believe it was the University of Wisconsin-Madison, pictured here. He found out that you can actually use sensors in cell phone cameras to detect cosmic rays from outer space. Wow. So he took that and he kept going with it, right? The cell phone was never meant to do this, right? That's not the reason the phone was invented. But he found out if you could take the principle of that piece of technology in that phone and combine it with the concept of a mobile network, right? All of a sudden we have a planetary system, right, around the globe that can monitor for cosmic rays, right, to further the science and understanding. Again, that's about the unintended use, right? And again, that can really be one of the most powerful drivers of innovation. So I wanted to briefly wrap up before we jump into questions with mentioning a really great book written by the Kelly brothers. And again, if you're familiar with any of the IDEA work, there are an exceptional number of examples and things that you can take out of this book to bring to you as an individual, to a team, right, to help drive creativity. One of the stories that that's often talked about by Tom is, as adults, and even early as children, we'll start there. We're kind of started to be driven in a direction where we're taught we're not creative, right? But we're all creative people. That's the problem with that, right? All of the discouragement we have received over the years of growing up have put us in a position to say, we're not creative, right? That's when we walk into those rooms with the executives and we get to the innovative steps and they step out, right? And that's because there's a fear to be creative, right? There's a fear to be innovative. There's a fear of the unknown. And that's what we as architects, again, need to support. Not by providing a coloring book, right? But by providing at least some sort of foundation so that people can innovate on. So, 4 words for you. Imagine, right? Keep imagining. Inspire. That's really our job as architects, at least from an artistic standpoint, right? We need to inspire the people we work with. Again, the executives, the employees, regardless of who it is. We have to continually to help people think differently about the world around us. Create, right? Get your hands on. Be visual. Use all of those things in your toolkit to continue to push forward how we create things, right? And lastly, innovate. That's really our job as architects, right? Again, driving innovation. So thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Sure.
So my question's actually 2 parts, I think. You talked a lot about the customer, and you talked about like the customer needs, the customer values, customer experience. So the first part of my question is, with all of those things at play, is that why it's so? Do you think that that's part of why customers have such a difficulty actually being satisfied with products, with their experience?
So I would say yes. When we look at how consumers act in the world today, there's a lot of, and I can't tell you the number of times, people pick up a piece of technology and say, well, if only it did this, or if only it did that, right? So I think a lot of that perspective is driven by, again, getting back to preference, right? And I think that's kind of the disconnect, too. We talk a lot about customer needs, and we connect the artifacts we create with customer needs, and it really goes deeper than that. So I think really trying to drive it from that perspective of saying, and again, that's why I love the approach from a human-centered design perspective, right? Because we're actually going out, we're talking to real people, we're understanding their real situations. We're not just lumping people into a bucket and saying they need food to survive, right? We're understanding more, again, of what are their preferences, what are their emotions when they engage with our products, with our brand. And that's really what's kind of driving that perspective.
Well, and actually you answered the second part, which was kind of how can architecture help with that? And I think between that and the four things you said. So I only had one question, not two.
Sure. Well, and I think that's a really important point to make, though. Again, taking the tools that we use on a daily basis and figuring out how they connect with the customer, right? How they connect, not just by meeting those needs, right, but on an emotional level, again, right? So if you're a data architect, right, with a certain piece of information, ask yourself, how does this make people feel, right? Not just how do they necessarily use it, right? And is there form to it, not just the function perspective. And I think even by being able to start having those conversations, as architects, we can start driving, again, that change in thinking and driving our organizations to be more innovative. So, again, I understand there's not a place on every single diagram to represent that, but make sure that it's at least up here, right? And it's part of that story that you're going to tell.
Do you have an example of where you've applied this approach at work? I believe you're with the Principal Financial Group. Is that correct? And as you applied it, how you delivered something differently because of your approach versus, say, less creative approaches, I guess, to architecture?
Sure. Yeah, I work with Cigna. No, and that's fine. Formerly Principal. Yes, absolutely. And I think, I'll say this. From a business architecture perspective, it's a whole heck of a lot easier to do from driving change, right? And so, I've been in areas before that were very, or have gone into areas before that were very process-centric. Again, very internally focused, right? And I think part of architecture, for me, was providing that foundation to kind of open their eyes, right? To be able to see, actually, what you're doing is for these people over here. And I think a lot of times that is organizations is what we forget. And that these people over here, they have emotions. So, a lot of things we did, initiatives just to even try to get the employees to understand who these people over here, right, our customer, really are. What do they think? How do they feel? And then going back to the drawing board and saying, okay, let's create our architectural diagram, and now let's align it with that. And did it fit? No. But that's good, right? Because that's what kind of enabled us to drive innovation forward, right? We started to be able to think about things differently and really figure out how should we engage this group, right? How can we really meet their needs and that emotional side? So, I think a lot of it from even a user experience standpoint, and I know we get probably a little bit easier from a technology and usability perspective, right? But those are really important things to consider. So, as you're putting together the framework for a web service, right? Figure out how your users are going to engage, what their emotions are going to be, right? And again, driving it from that artistic standpoint, because that's really where the innovation is going to come from. So, again, you may not have a spot for it in every diagram, but it needs to be really part of that story that you tell. Sounds good to me.
Okay, thanks, Kyle.
Thanks.